I'd like to welcome everyone back to the panel room. We've got a panel today on horror after the pandemic. Where did the zombies go from here? And with this panel, I'm just going to go around the room and let everyone introduce themselves and let us know a little of their history with the horror genre. We'll go ahead and start with you, Michele.
Hi, so happy to be here. I'm Michele Berger, and I write across the speculative fiction universe. I write magical realism, fantasy, science fiction, but everything that I write has a tinge of horror. And I feel like I come at horror a little bit differently in that when I was young, I was like a horror media fan, but I didn't sort of read a lot of horror. And I read, and also I read a lot of science fiction. And as a writer, I always identified myself as a kind of a sci-fi person. But really, a couple of years ago, when my novella called Reenu-You first came out, when I was talking to other writers, they were like, why don't you claim horror and dark fiction? Like everything you do has this horror element. And so I feel like I'm a recent, like fully embracing horror and loving it. And my novella is about a mysterious virus that gets transmitted through an everyday hair care product. And it's set in the 1990s and sort of edges at the beginning of an apocalypse.
All right, great. Next, Tyler.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. So I've been a full-time indie author for about 7 years. Just passed my writerversary, which is May 1st every year, so I always remember that. But I write science fiction, post-apocalyptic, and horror. I've wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid, and I was a huge Stephen King and Dean Koontz fan. And then I life got in the way, went a couple different paths in life, music, the corporate world, all that stuff. And then a couple years ago, well, about 7 or 8 years ago now, I won a Kindle at a corporate work party. And I kind of discovered that people were, writing Kindle books and horror and post-apoc and stuff, and kind of got into it that way and went full time. And actually the initial series that kind of sprung me off was a zombie series called Contamination. So that's kind of, I guess my little twist is that basically the food and drink is contaminated, and that's what turns people into zombies. And it's kind of, based in a smaller, it's more of a regional thing. So what if the zombie apocalypse was triggered by someone, intentionally, and it was a trial run for something larger? So that's kind of my my flagship series was a zombie series, and I've written a bunch of stuff after that. So been having fun.
All right, great. And finally, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Strand. My niche is basically horror with lots of humor in it. I kind of mix up the formula with each book. So some are really heavily comedic and some are a little more serious, but there is generally horror and humor in most of what I've written. I've also done some young adult books that are just pure goofy comedies, generally aimed at kids who don't like to read. So the librarian can say, hey, you hate to read? Well, this book is really stupid. You'll like this. And they often do. So yeah, but basically the humor thing is what I'm mostly known for. So that's me.
Okay, great. And so you kind of touched on a little, Michele, but let me go through each of you and kind of go why you picked horror and what keeps you coming back to it as opposed to other writing.
So for me, I'm really interested in how people are othered in society, and horror provides a great way to look at the, contradictions and complexities of being othered around race, around gender. And so that is something that I'm always interested in, and that shows up in my writing, and just interested in terms of just as a genre. I also feel like I grew up, I'm a Gen Xer, and I was watching a lot of like inappropriate things for my age in terms of horror. And that it's just something that kind of filtered down through my very essence. And so even when I try to write something that's not sort of horror, and I do more psychological horror, it's there. And I think particularly for people writing from historically marginalized communities, horror offers a way to rethink all of these tropes. Like if you think about some of the standard tropes of horror and how they do or don't fit certain communities, there's a lot there to work with, as well as kind of new ideas about horror. And horror is having a renaissance. I feel like, 20 something years ago, people didn't talk about speculative fiction the way they do now. It was almost like, oh, you write science fiction, you kind of weird person. And I think that was true for horror as well. But now there's just been this amazing renaissance in terms of both, in literature and as well as in film and TV. So I think it's an exciting time to write horror.
Okay, great. And Jeff, for you as well, but also kind of how you mix humor in with horror, because it's not something you normally think.
I didn't like, as a real little kid, I didn't like horror at all. I was way too cowardly. So I didn't watch horror movies or read horror fiction. I was purely on the humor side. So the Beverly Cleary, the Judy Blume, anything that was funny, I enjoyed. So, and I have a cat who's just interrupted us. But, so anyway, so I started out as a comedy writer. I wanted to be Douglas Adams. I didn't want to be Stephen King. And then my first few books that I wrote were humor books, but I messed with the genre each time. So it would be, okay, here's my fantasy comedy, here's my romantic comedy, here's my mainstream comedy. And then I did a book that was supposed to be a mystery comedy, but went way, way darker than intended. And I got started the really early days of e-publishing back in 2000 when everyone hated ebooks. And so when I sold my first one, I had a big backlog. So I had a whole bunch of books come out all at once. And it was the mystery horror one that did the best. And suddenly people were like, oh, he writes horror. And by then I was enjoying horror movies and horror fiction, but did not consider myself a horror writer. But I thought, well, you know what? I need to branch out a little bit. Not branch out. I need to brand myself a little bit better instead of the comedy guy, because if you write comedy, you don't go to any specific place on the bookstore shelf. You go to the mystery or the romance or whatever it is. So I thought, well, I'll go with horror comedy because that's what I was best branded as. And so then I kind of purposely stuck with that. I have branched out of that with the occasional book, but then I always come back to it. So that's what got me into it. What keeps me in it is that with horror, you can pretty much write any kind of book you want and still call it a horror novel. So my books, they're all really different. There's not a strong formula that I use. If I had written this many books in the mystery genre, I don't know that I would still have ideas. I think I would just be burnt out. If I were doing, a lot of other genres, I would just say, I'm 50 books in, I'm done. I cannot think of any more things. Whereas horror, you can do so much stuff with it. You can do a romance novel that's a horror novel. You can do an action novel that's a horror novel. You can do pretty much anything with the genre and just keep it fresh. So that's what keeps me there.
All right, great. Now, that sounds a lot like what I heard from people like Lucian Diver and AJ Hartley about YA, that it seems to be kind of an overarching genre. Would you agree?
Yeah, when I write YA, I don't write YA, I write young adult comedies. And so in that, I can do anything I want within that. So.
Okay, great. And finally, Tyler.
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved horror. Growing up, like I said, I was a big Stephen King, Dean Koontz fan. I think the first Koontz book that really kind of grabbed me was Twilight Eyes, which I had a buddy that recommended it. And if I'm remembering right, it was about a kid who can kind of see these. I think he was like a carny or something. He could see monsters that nobody else could see around him, and it just reeled me right in. I was like, man, this is great. So, and then I was as a kid, I was into Christopher Pike a lot. Which was where we had all the cool different colors on the spines and Walden books. I used to go in there and grab all those and just churn through them. And I started writing a lot of horror back then. And I actually used to submit to publishing companies when I was like 8 or 10 years old. So I'd send like my press packet and all that. And I got some personalized rejection letters back then, which is kind of cool for a kid. I think I put my age in there. That's probably why they wrote me back. But yeah, they never did publish the stories, but it kind of, kept me going. But strangely, I don't think I was allowed to watch a lot of horror movies back then. So I think books were kind of my way around that. So like for some reason, it's like, oh, you can't see Friday the 13th, but I can read Stephen King's Misery. I'm like, oh, all right, cool. So I would just, whatever way I could get into it, I would. And as far as kind of what's kept me in, I guess like Jeff was saying, there's a lot of things you can do with horror in general. And I just like kind of exploring how people band together against the common evil. whether they get along or don't get along, and just, seeing the hope through the darkness and all that kind of stuff. And people finding common ground and fighting things together, I think, is always really cool, seeing how they survive.
Great. And now moving into kind of our current situation, I'll go ahead and start with you, Jeff. What impact do you think this pandemic is going to have on horror as a genre going forward? Or is there going to be
I don't know. I'm kind of in this weird situation where I have no idea, because I wrote my last book, The Odds, was written during, the pandemic, obviously. And it takes place at the beginning in a casino, and the casinos were closed. And it's like, okay, is this book, are the casinos going to reopen? Is this book going to obviously be a pre-pandemic, automatically, or will we sort of get back to normal? So I've kind of, at this point, taken the approach of, I'm not going to worry about it too much, because I can't predict the future. Like, I don't know if having characters shake hands, is that over? Are movie theaters over? There's too much stuff. It's like if you were trying to write a novel that took place in the real world immediately after 9/11 and didn't quite know what the impact is going to be. I think that's where we are now. It's like, I don't want to write a book where everyone is staying 6 feet away from each other at all times, and then find out that it very specifically places it in May 2020. So it's kind of, for right now, and it's not going to last very much longer, I'm kind of in the pretend it's not happening, just so that I don't do weird dating on my book, because I don't know what is going to be the stuff that goes back to normal, and I don't know what's going to be the equivalent of having a character get to the airport 20 minutes early and just go through the metal detector at the airport. So for right now, I'm just kind of in the, I don't know what's going to happen, so pretend everything's going to go back to normal, even though it obviously won't, but I don't know what the key elements that are going to change are.
Exactly. Michele.
Yeah, echoing a little bit of what Jeff said. So I'm currently writing a horror novel that takes place in the Great Dismal Swamp. And because of some of the things that are going on in the novel, it really will be a pre-May 2019 novel. And that's okay. I mean, when you think about, September 11th, people didn't necessarily want to read about certain things that were happening right then, right? So that, so just kind of the sense of like expansiveness. And, part of it is we don't know, like it's going to take so much for us to symbolically, to digest what's happening. Like when we've gone out and seen the supermarkets empty and, the streets empty, like I feel like we don't know yet how we're really gonna use our imagination to bring that out. So I think in like 3 to 5 years, there'll be some trends around like that you can chart of like what horror is doing. But I was thinking, I think there's going to be like a deepening actually of that kind of sociological horror. Because if you think about, people are stuck at home with their kids and fiancés and partners and spouses, and they're learning all sorts of things, good and things that are probably new and surprising. So I feel like there could be like intimate horror, like that sense of like, what you're discovering in your environment, since we're kind of contained. So I feel like there's going to be some of that, and people in really difficult emotional situations that go through kind of surviving this next phase. And I do think, so, sociological horror, and also how we're processing, disparities. So Reenu-You takes place in the 1990s, and it's really about how women, particularly women of color, had to come together to figure out what was going on related to this mysterious virus. And it deals with a lot of racial and gender health disparities. And I think, so I think how that gets manifested in horror fiction, I don't know, but I do think how we're trying to understand like xenophobia, disparities, and how people play with that. And then the last thing I'll say is, I wonder about the role of the supernatural, because we're so inundated with science discourse. And so I wonder if people are going to want to retreat into spaces that they haven't really explored before, because our houses are kind of like a haunted house in some ways when you think about like how we're living right this moment. So I just wonder about how will there be a resurgence of like horror fairy tales, or will people really want to go into these supernatural spaces to get away from kind of this medicalized, sterile. So those are some thoughts.
What you, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in the same spot. So I think it's inevitable that some things are going to change. How much of that stays around, where we go from here, it's tough to know. So for the most part, I'm kind of writing things business as usual and sort of pre-pandemic type of stuff. But then on another note, I kind of actually was inspired to write something that's just completely immersed in where we're at now. And then I kind of like accelerated kind of a dark part of where we could go. And it was kind of therapeutic. So I wrote a short story that's maybe 5,000 or 6,000 words that I'm pretty happy with, but you could almost put a timestamp on right now with that one. So yeah, it's tough to know what's going to change and what's going to stick around. But to Michelle's point, I kind of keep up on the marketing end and stuff of ebooks. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, just kind of on some of the analytical ebook sales and stuff that's going on. And I guess pre-pandemic, last fall, the number one post-apocalyptic category was actually pandemic stuff. So it was kind of like a foresight type of thing, or what not really, but and then now I think ebooks overall are up. People are home, they're reading a lot more ebooks, they're listening to more audiobooks. But I think post-apoc has taken a little bit of a dip, and I'm thinking kind of like what you're saying, it's almost like it's a little too close to home right now. So maybe we will see more of the fantastical elements and, some more escapism kind of stuff going on where people gravitate towards stuff that isn't just what we're living, So I guess, remains to be seen, but that's my 2 cents.
Okay. And basically going off of what Michelle was saying, that kind of reaches some of the points that I was looking at, taking it to a different level. But at the same time, do you think the readers out there now have a more intimate knowledge of some of the stuff that you try to give out in, apocalyptic horror or horror in general, because they've had to isolate themselves? They've had to be worried about the person next to them. And, it's this level of, I guess, stress that they've had to go through for months on end at this point. Will that make its way into your writing? And this goes out to all three of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are going to have a lot more knowledge about all this stuff, for sure. I mean, it's inevitable. People are going to know a lot more about that stuff, and it's probably going to creep into more general knowledge. So, I'm sure that'll kind of make its way into fiction as well.
I think the idea that characters can be too stupid to live is over. Like, you used to say, come on, this character, no one would do that. When you watch The Walking Dead, episode 2 of The Walking Dead establishes that if you smear zombie guts on yourself, they won't go near you. And a criticism is, well, why don't they just have zombie guts on themselves? Well, because people won't wear a frickin' mask out in public. So the idea that people will behave in intelligent ways in the middle of a pandemic, I think, is over as far as credible character development goes. It's like if you tried to have people in your book as stupid as they are in the real world, it would defy suspension of disbelief.
It's funny because you get a lot of critique. I've gotten critique before, like, "Oh, this guy would never act that way," and now we've seen people act in all variety of ways. So it's kind of you're gonna get characters that will do smart things and stupid things.
I wrote a zombie novel where the character said, "We're going outside. We don't care if the zombies are out there to kill us. You're not going to restrict our freedoms." Readers would say that's stupid. People don't do that. Well, they do.
Yeah, we've got proof.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see how. Like that sense of pushing against the tropes, and y'all have written a lot more apocalyptic fiction and sort of zombie fiction. I think about the film. I did not read the book, but the film Girl with All the Gifts, and how that really kind of just pushed on some of the standard tropes. And I think I think that's going to be interesting, and also globally, like how are people dealing with this in Singapore, versus the U.S. and other places. So it'll be interesting to see too how other communities take up some of these questions and what their version is of the good life and the apocalyptic life.
Exactly. And have you guys in your social media noticed anything from your readers? Are they wanting more, wanting less? Are you getting any sense from them of what they're thinking about your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think ebooks, like I said, seem to be doing um, a lot better in general, just because, you know, because of circumstance, people are stuck at home, and, you know, I don't know, you've got again, you've got a whole array of people. You've got people that have kids at home now that are kind of doubling as teachers, so there's that aspect. So there's probably people that have less time to read, but then you have people that, you know, maybe their kids are older or whatever, and they have more time to read. But I think overall, ebooks have been up a lot as far as sales and stuff, and people are kind of diving into that. I'm sure for paperbacks and everything too. So yeah, I think I don't know. To Michelle's point, I think people will probably always be looking for something that's unique in terms of like the zombie genre. You know, if you can get like a unique take on it and spin it a certain way, and again, maybe it will. I don't know. Zombies, I think, are far enough from a pandemic where it's still kind of like an escape. So it's like, you know, I don't think many of us believe that it'll actually happen. The zombie part, the undead, and all that stuff, it's still a little bit out there. So maybe it's still a good escape for
That's
people.
early in the year too, so.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So the novella was republished with Falstaff Books this year, and you know, it's interesting because I think people were watching. To Tyler's point, I saw some data that people early in the pandemic were watching a lot of films about pandemics, but then reading about pandemics not so much. But I think because my novella is also about female friendship and conspiracy theories, it kind of has other things to pull people in if they don't want to read about epidemics. So it's actually been doing, I think, pretty decently. But you know, it's hard to say, and I imagine for all of us, our readers, you know, come at our work in from different places and different interests.
Yeah, my first book to come out post-pandemic, post-social distancing, is a book called Allison, and it's basically if Stephen King's Carrie lived to be 45, and you know, she basically could break your bones with her mind and couldn't control the power. So she lives completely by herself. She can't really interact with anyone. And it's a social distancing book that was written before the pandemic, but came out after it. And I didn't get feedback on that aspect, but from a promotion standpoint, I'm like, I need to downplay that, because I don't want people to say, oh, here's a book about someone who can't interact with fellow human beings. That sounds like a delightful read in my current situation. So I kind of, you know, I didn't want to, one, promote it as something that's too close to the misery you're living right now. And also I didn't want to look like I was trying to capitalize on it. Like, you know, 100,000 people dead. Hey, read my book that's kind of like that too. So I have purposely, you know, tried to steer away from any kind of promotion that could tie it too much into the pandemic. I'm certainly not going to write a specific pandemic themed novel, mostly because a lot of what I do is overtly humorous. And so you don't want to, hey kids, let's laugh at the horrific death count. So I'm pretty much steering away from anything that's too close to the current reality.
And we normally see in horror, at least from what I've read in the books that I've read, that you can't keep the person and this heightened sense, the reader, for very long because it'll wear them out. Yet, right now with the pandemic, we've been, a little over 2 months at this heightened level. It's like a horror story in the sense that there's still way too many unanswered questions. And like you guys were saying, you've got the people, the stupid person that would never act like that. You've got the smart ones, you know, few and far between, it seems. So will that, just kind of bringing it back into everyone's writing, and not only just for you guys, but in TV shows and stuff that we're going to see coming out, do you think that it's going to have a more lasting impact, or is this something that's going to be temporary and people want to forget about it as soon as, you know, we're all released from lockdown? And I'll go ahead and start with Jeff, if that works for you.
I think it kind of depends on how long this goes. You know, are we headed, is it going to slowly wind down, or are we headed for wave 2? You know, if this is our reality for the next couple of years, I think it will have a much more long-term impact than if we're kind of already over the worst of it. I'm cynical and thinking we're probably are headed for a wave 2 in relation to my comment about stupidity. But if we're not, if it's kind of, you know, fading out, I don't know that it'll have that big of a impact, because, you know, once you can go back to restaurants and movie theaters and the world starts to return to normal, there's no compelling reason to go back and say, hey, remember that horrible time in early 2020? Let's write about that. I think you can sort of move past that. So it's sort of, at this point, there's no end date in sight. So it kind of depends. Is it a year and a half till we get a vaccine, or are we kind of on the downward slope? Until we know that, it's really impossible to say how it's going to impact entertainment. Especially, you know, if you're doing independently published books, you can have them out, you know, when they're ready. So as soon as the book is done, you put it up there, it's much more current. Someone like me who self-publishes a lot of his horror has to think about it a little bit more than a traditionally published book that's not going to come out for 2 years anyway, where you can't even pretend. Whereas the book I'm writing on now, when it comes out, we'll still be in the midst of it. So I probably have to think about it a little more, which is to purposely ignore it, but I still think about it. So I think it's just, we don't know how long this is going to go, which would, you know, define how much it needs to be incorporated into future works.
All right, thank you so much. And before we end it for the day, oh, sure.
Can I take a stab at that too? Because I wonder too if it will be the young people who are like 12 now or 9 and like high school age, who, you know, all of us who are adults and ostensibly have lived full lives, it is impacting us. But, you know, creatively, when you think about, you know, everything is more intense when you're an adolescent anyway. So I wonder, will it be that generation will take up these themes and we'll see something, you know, 15, 20 years from now that kind of deals with this moment in very different ways than us as writers will in terms of artistic creation. Because, you know, like all of us have said, Tyler, it's so cool that you've already like written a short story like in this moment. But, you know, I wonder about.
We'll see. We'll see. Maybe people will say, I don't want to read this thing. What are you doing?
I know. I bet they will. So, you know, I think it'll be interesting to see what, like the waves of how people process what's happened.
All right. That leaves a lot of thought for us to process. And let's go around the room, let everyone know where they can find you on your socials. We'll start with you, Tyler.
Yeah, sure. I'm at twpiperbrook.com or facebook.com/twpiperbrook. And I've got all my stuff up on Amazon or Audible.
All right, great. Jeff?
I am www.jeffstrand.com. I'm on Facebook as Jeff Strand Author because someone took Jeff Strand, and I'm on Twitter as Jeff Strand.
Finally, Michele.
I am on Twitter, Michele T. Berger, and Michele with 1 L, and Berger, not like the hamburger, but Berger. And I run a blog for writers and readers called The Practice of Creativity. You can find me there. And Reenu-You is on Amazon and other online places.
All right, great. And I want to thank you all for coming in, and thank you for watching. See you the next time in the panel room. Bye.
Thanks a lot.